Empires rise. Systems break. History leaves scars that never fully disappear.
When people think about war, they usually think about missiles, airstrikes, soldiers, and territory. They imagine military force in its most visible form. But in the modern world, some of the most powerful weapons are not always the ones that explode on camera. Sometimes the most dangerous weapon is the one that quietly moves through ships, pipelines, refineries, and fuel markets. That is why oil matters so much in the Iran war. The real danger is not only that Iran, Israel, and the United States could pull the Middle East into a wider military conflict. The real danger is that this conflict is centered around one of the most important energy choke points on Earth. Once that choke point comes under pressure, oil stops being just a commodity. It becomes leverage. It becomes a multiplier of fear, inflation, and global instability. Reuters reported that tanker traffic through the Strait of Hormuz effectively came to a standstill at one stage of the conflict, while oil flows were estimated to be down by about 90%. Goldman Sachs warned that if flows do not recover, oil prices could move above $100 per barrel very quickly. That is what makes this crisis so different from an ordinary regional war. A missile can destroy a target. Oil can destabilize an entire system. If enough supply is delayed, stranded, or seen as unreliable, the effect spreads outward through shipping, manufacturing, inflation, consumer prices, and political decision-making. Reuters reported that the current crisis has already sent shockwaves through energy markets, with one of the strongest weekly price surges since the pandemic era. This is why the phrase oil weapon matters. It does not mean that oil is literally a missile. It means that in a world built on energy dependence, a disruption to oil flows can produce strategic pain far beyond the battlefield. Countries do not need to lose access forever. They only need to believe that access is becoming uncertain. Once markets begin to fear prolonged disruption, price spikes can do much of the damage by themselves. That is why this war matters far beyond Iran. The conflict is exposing a deeper truth about modern power. Military confrontation is one layer of pressure. Energy disruption is another. And in some cases, the second can become even more dangerous than the first, because it spreads through the daily life of the entire world.
A regional crisis becomes a global threat. The moment energy routes turn into battle lines.
The first reason oil could be the real weapon in this war is simple. The modern global economy still runs on fuel. Oil powers shipping, aviation, freight, industrial machinery, petrochemicals, refining, and a large share of transportation systems. Even economies that talk constantly about energy transition still rely heavily on crude and refined products to keep goods moving and prices stable. That means any serious disruption in the Gulf immediately becomes more than an energy story. It becomes a trade story, an inflation story, a consumer story, and eventually a political story. Reuters reported that Barclays expects Brent crude could test $120 per barrel if Middle East tensions persist for several more weeks. In a more extreme scenario, Barclays said Brent could even reach $150 before month's end. Reuters also reported that around 85 million barrels of oil are now stranded on tankers in the Middle East Gulf because of the disruption. That matters because oil shocks do not stay inside commodity markets. Once crude rises sharply, transportation becomes more expensive. once transportation becomes more expensive. Food distribution, imported goods, manufacturing inputs, and retail pricing all come under pressure. Once diesel rises, logistics networks become costlier. Once gasoline rises, public anger rises with it. This is why energy shocks often become political shocks. They are felt not just by traders and governments, but by ordinary households. Reuters reported that the Iran conflict has already pushed U.S. Gulf Coast heavy crude prices to their highest levels since 2020. Mars sour crude jumped to an $11 premium over WTI, up sharply from just $1.50 a week earlier, because refiners began scrambling for alternatives to disrupted Persian Gulf supply. That tells you something important. When Gulf supply is threatened, the market does not just become more expensive. It becomes more desperate for replacement barrels. This is the first lesson of the oil weapon. A real energy weapon does not need to destroy infrastructure everywhere. It only needs to make supply unreliable enough that every buyer starts bidding harder, hedging faster, and paying more. That is how regional conflict turns into global inflation.
What begins as a regional crisis never stays regional when energy, trade, and fear are tied to the same narrow corridor.
The second reason oil could be the real weapon in the Iran war is that energy markets run on confidence as much as supply. Physical flows matter, of course, but expectations matter too. If traders believe disruption will continue, they bid prices higher. If refiners believe cargoes may not arrive on time, they search for alternatives immediately. If governments fear extended pressure, they begin emergency planning. In that sense, oil is not just a material input, it is also a psychological trigger. That is exactly what makes the current moment so dangerous. Warriors reported that the effective closure of Hormuz has forced countries such as Iraq and Kuwait to reduce output, while analysts warned the disruption could spread to Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates if tensions continue. These are not small producers. They sit at the heart of the world's crude export system. Once markets begin to imagine broader supply strain across that system, prices can move violently even before the full damage has arrived. This is why oil becomes a strategic weapon in a choke point crisis. A choke point does not need to stay closed forever to change global behavior. It only needs to become risky enough that shipping delays, insurance costs, and uncertainty all start reinforcing one another. Once that happens, oil no longer behaves like a stable commodity. It starts behaving like a stress amplifier. That amplifier is already visible. Reuters reported that the current conflict has caused some of the strongest weekly oil gain since 2020, while shipping disruption and rising war risk costs have made replacement supply more expensive and harder to move. The result is not just tighter crude availability. It is a chain reaction that reaches refiners, freight operators, airlines, chemical producers, and consumers. This reveals something deeper about how modern wars work. The most dangerous weapon is not always the one that kills the most people directly. Sometimes it is the one that strikes the systems everyone depends on. In this case, oil is dangerous because it connects the battlefield to the gas station, the refinery to the supermarket, and the tankers in the Gulf to households thousands of miles away. That is why energy pressure can become more powerful than military spectacle. It touches everything.
When oil stops moving, the shock does not stay in the desert. It travels through the whole world.
The third reason oil could be the real weapon in this war is timing. If this crisis erupted in a calm and resilient global economy, the shock would still be serious, but markets might absorb it more easily. That is not the world we are in. Supply chains are already more fragile than they were a few years ago. Trade tensions remain high. Inflation is still politically sensitive. Shipping routes have already been strained by earlier disruption. Investors and governments are already alert to signs of another external shock. That makes an oil spike more dangerous than it would otherwise be. Reuters reported that the present fundamentals and risks in the oil market are now stronger than during the Russia-Ukraine conflict. According to Barclays, that is an extraordinary comparison, because the Russia-Ukraine war already reshaped energy politics on a global scale. If analysts now believe this Middle East crisis could produce even stronger oil market fundamentals, then the threat is clearly not being treated as a routine geopolitical flare-up. This is where the hidden logic of the oil weapon becomes clear. Oil matters not only because it powers economies, but because it sits at the intersection of inflation, growth, politics, and confidence. A sharp rise in crude does not only hurt consumers. It pressures central banks, complicates fiscal planning, raises transport costs, tightens industrial margins, and weakens confidence in future stability. When that happens during an already tense global environment, oil becomes more than a resource. It becomes a strategic destabilizer. That is why this story matters. The Iran war is not dangerous only because of military escalation. It is dangerous because it is taking place in the one region where conflict can still reprice the global energy system almost overnight. Reuters reporting over the last several days has shown the pattern clearly. Hormuz traffic collapsed. Oil flows dropped sharply. Major producers faced outages or reduced exports. Prices surged. Alternative grades became more expensive, and analysts began openly discussing scenarios above $100,120 and even $150 per barrel. History teaches the same lesson again and again. The most powerful weapon is not always the most visible one. Sometimes it is the thing that everyone depends on, but almost no one notices until it becomes unstable. That is exactly what oil is in this war. It is not just a commodity. It is leverage over inflation, transport industry, and political confidence. It is the bridge between a regional conflict and a global bill. If you want to understand where the next major global shock could come from, do not just watch the missiles. Watch the tankers, the refineries, the oil benchmarks, the insurance costs, and the choke points that keep fuel moving. Because that is where the real story begins.
We are not just following events. We are tracing the forces that move them.